I inherited a 7,500-acre buffalo ranch. HOA demanded I remove my bison in 14 days. Map. I inherited a massive buffalo ranch, but an HOA demanded my bison disappear in 14 days until hidden family records revealed the truth. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I heard that morning was not the sound of my buffalo. It was the sound of someone arriving to tell me they believed they owned a piece of my family's history. The engines of 3 black SUVs echoed across my private road just after sunrise. I was standing near the old wooden gate of my ranch, watching the morning fog slowly disappear over the fields. The air smelled like cold grass, fresh soil, and the faint scent of rain left behind from the night before. In the distance, my buffalo moved quietly across the open land. For most people, it was just a herd. For me, it was part of a promise. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and 6 months earlier, I inherited a 7,500-acre buffalo ranch that had been in my family for generations. When my father passed away, he didn't just leave me land. He left me responsibility. I spent years away from the ranch, building a different life, but I always knew this place would call me back someday. The fences, the fields, the old barns, and the buffalo were all pieces of a story my family had spent decades protecting. My father used to tell me something I never forgot. Land isn't valuable because of what you can build on it. It's valuable because of what you're willing to protect. I didn't fully understand those words when I was younger. I understood them the day Victoria Langford stepped onto my property. The SUVs stopped near the gate. The doors opened. Victoria walked toward me with 2 HOA board members behind her. She looked completely out of place, standing on a working ranch. Her expensive coat was spotless. Her boots had never touched this kind of dirt. And in her hand was a folder that looked more important to her than the land surrounding us. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I'm Victoria Langford, president of the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association." I nodded. "I know who you are." Her expression didn't change. "I'm here regarding a property compliance issue." I looked behind her, then back at her. "A property compliance issue?" She opened the folder. "Yes." She removed a document and handed it to me. I looked down. At first, I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Then I saw the title, HOA Removal Notice. My eyes moved to the next line. Owner must remove all bison from the property within 14 days. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood what I was reading. "You want me to remove my buffalo?" Victoria folded her hands. "We believe the animals create concerns for nearby residents and affect the character of the surrounding community." I looked across the field. The buffalo were calm. They were exactly where they had always been, on my land. "Victoria," I said, "this ranch existed long before your community." She gave a small smile. "That may be true, but everyone who lives nearby deserves protection." Protection. That word stayed in my mind, because I knew what it really meant. Control. She wasn't asking about my animals. She wasn't asking about my family. She was telling me that someone with a position inside a neighborhood association believed they could decide what belonged on land they never owned. I looked at the paper again. 14 days. A deadline. A demand. A challenge. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. My father taught me that the person who reacts first often reveals the most. So I folded the notice carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket. Victoria looked surprised. Maybe she expected anger. Maybe she expected fear. She didn't know me yet. She didn't know my family's history. And she definitely didn't know what my father had left behind. Because beneath the dust, beneath the old buildings, beneath decades of ranch life, there were records. There was proof. And there was a reason my family had protected this land for so long. Victoria believed 14 days was enough time to erase my buffalo. She was about to learn that 14 days was enough time for me to uncover the truth. The hardest part about coming home wasn't rebuilding the ranch. It was realizing someone else believed they had the right to decide its future. The morning after Victoria Langford left my property, I woke up before sunrise. The ranch was quiet. The kind of quiet I had missed during all the years I spent away. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hand and looked across the fields. The first light of day touched the grass, and the buffalo moved slowly through the mist like they had done every morning for decades. Nothing had changed, and that was exactly why Victoria's demand bothered me. She acted as if something was wrong. But the ranch was operating the same way it always had. The fences were standing. The animals were healthy. The land was being cared for. The only new problem was the person who believed she could control it. I walked back inside and placed the HOA notice on my kitchen table. 14 days. I kept looking at those words. Not because I was afraid. Because I wanted to understand where Victoria believed her authority came from. A demand like that doesn't appear out of nowhere. Someone either has power, or they believe they do. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the paperwork that came with my inheritance. The ranch documents were organized, but my father had always been the type of person who kept more than just official records. He saved history, receipts, maps, letters, old notes written in his handwriting. My father believed every piece of information had value. You never know when someone will question what you've built, he once told me. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he was talking about something exactly like this. I searched through cabinets in the old office beside the main house. The room still smelled like him. Old wood, leather, dust from years of work. His tools were still arranged on the shelves. His notebooks were still stacked near the desk. It felt like he had just stepped outside and would return any moment. Then I found a drawer I had almost forgotten about. Inside were several folders with dates written on the labels. The oldest one caught my attention. Original ranch records. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk. The folder was worn. The edges were damaged. But someone had carefully protected it for years. I opened the first page. It was a property map. Not a recent one. An old one. The kind of map created before modern neighborhoods surrounded the area. I studied the lines carefully. The ranch boundaries were clear. The land was exactly where my father said it was. I continued through the documents. Old purchase records. Survey information. Maintenance agreements. Every page told the same story. This ranch had existed long before the developments around it. Long before HOA meetings. Long before Victoria Langford decided my land needed her approval. I sat back in the chair and looked at the documents spread across the desk. For the first time since she arrived, I felt something different. Not frustration. Not anger. Clarity. Victoria believed she had started a battle over animals. But she had actually started a battle over history. And history leaves evidence. That afternoon, I drove into town to visit the county records office. I wanted confirmation. Not because I doubted what my father left behind. Because I knew something important. Being right is not enough. You have to prove it. The clerk helped me locate additional records connected to the ranch. The information matched everything I already found. The property was legitimate. The boundaries were documented. And nothing showed that the HOA had control over my land. When I returned home, another message was waiting from Victoria. She wanted an HOA meeting. A formal review. Her words sounded professional. Calm. Almost reasonable. But I understood what she was doing. She was preparing the room before I entered. She wanted everyone to hear her version first. I looked out toward the fields. The buffalo were moving through the evening light. And I realized something. Victoria had spent her time preparing an argument. I had spent mine finding the truth. She thought 14 days was a deadline. I saw it as a countdown. Because every day brought me closer to proving she never had the authority to demand anything at all. The easiest way to control people is to make them believe they are protecting something. Victoria Langford understood that better than anyone, and that was exactly why she was dangerous. The day after I returned from the county records office, I noticed something different around the ranch. The land was the same. The buffalo were the same. But the way people looked at me had changed. That was when I realized Victoria had already started telling her version of the story. She didn't need to win the argument at my gate. She needed to win it before anyone else heard my side. That afternoon, I drove past Silver Pines Estates for the first time since the HOA notice arrived. The neighborhood looked exactly like something from a brochure. Perfect lawns, fresh paint, clean sidewalks, everything organized down to the smallest detail. And standing near the community entrance was a large sign announcing the next HOA meeting. At the bottom was a message about preserving community standards. I stopped for a moment and looked at those words. Community standards. It sounded harmless, almost helpful, but I had learned that the most powerful words are often the ones that hide the real meaning. When I returned to the ranch, I found another envelope waiting near my mailbox. This time, it wasn't a removal notice. It was an invitation. A formal HOA review meeting. Victoria wanted the entire community involved. I knew exactly why. She wanted an audience. That evening, I sat at my father's old desk and reviewed everything again. The documents, the maps, the records. I didn't want to walk into that meeting believing I was right. I wanted to walk in knowing I could prove it. The next morning, I started looking deeper into the HOA rules themselves. I compared every section, related to property restrictions, animal policies, and community authority. The more I read, the clearer the situation became. The HOA had rules, but rules were not ownership. A neighborhood association could create standards for its residents. It could manage shared spaces. It could enforce agreements that people accepted, but it could not simply reach across a property line and decide what belonged on land it never owned. That was the difference Victoria ignored, or maybe the difference she hoped nobody would notice. A few days before the meeting, I received another call. This time, it was from one of my neighbors. A man named Robert had lived near the ranch for years. "I just wanted to hear your side," he said. His voice sounded uncertain. I understood why. When someone presents themselves as an authority figure, people naturally assume they know what they are talking about. I told him the truth. I told him about the ranch records, the original boundaries, the history of the buffalo, the documents proving the timeline. There was a long silence. Then Robert said something I didn't expect. "I wish I had known that before." That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't just about Robert. It was about everyone who had only heard one version. Victoria wasn't fighting my buffalo anymore. She was fighting the truth becoming public. The night before the HOA meeting, I organized my documents one final time. I placed the original property map on top, then the ownership records, then the conservation paperwork. Everything had a purpose. Everything told part of the story. Before going to bed, I walked outside. The moon was bright over the fields. The buffalo moved slowly through the grass. I stood there listening to the quiet. This ranch had survived storms, seasons, years of change. It had survived everything because my family never treated it like something disposable. And now someone wanted to erase that history with a meeting and a piece of paper. But Victoria made one mistake. She thought she was bringing me into her world. She thought the HOA meeting was where she had the advantage. She didn't realize I had been preparing for that moment since the day I opened my father's old records. Because when the truth finally enters the room, power has a way of changing hands. The moment someone believes a title gives them unlimited power is the moment they forget one important thing. Titles can disappear, but the truth remains. The HOA meeting room was already crowded when I arrived. I parked my truck outside Silver Pines Estates and looked through the windows of the community center. People were gathering. Neighbors were talking. Some glanced in my direction. Others quickly looked away. I knew what they had heard. Victoria Langford had spent days preparing this moment. She had created a story where my ranch was the problem, where my buffalo were a threat, where my family's land was something that needed to be controlled. But tonight, I wasn't walking into that room to defend my reputation. I was walking in to reveal the truth. Inside, Victoria stood at the front of the room beside a large screen. She looked confident, prepared, the same way she looked when she handed me that 14-day notice. "Thank you all for coming," she began. Her voice was calm, professional. She spoke about safety concerns. She spoke about neighborhood expectations. She spoke about protecting property values. Every sentence sounded reasonable. That was what made it effective. Victoria didn't present herself as someone trying to take control. She presented herself as someone trying to help. And for a moment, I understood why some people believed her. She knew how to make authority sound like responsibility. When she finished, she displayed pictures of my buffalo near the property line. "These animals create uncertainty for residents," she said. A few people in the room nodded. Then Victoria looked at me. "Ethan, this is your opportunity to explain why you believe these animals should remain." I stood up slowly. I carried no anger into that room. Only a folder. I placed it on the table. "This isn't about whether someone likes buffalo," I said. The room became quiet. "This is about whether someone has the right to control property they do not own." I opened the folder. The first document was the original property deed. This ranch existed before Silver Pines Estates. I placed the old map beside it. These boundaries were established decades before this HOA existed. People leaned forward. They weren't listening to an argument anymore. They were looking at evidence. I continued. These records show the history of this land. They show how my family managed this ranch and protected the buffalo over generations. Victoria stepped forward. I don't believe those documents change the concerns of the community. I looked at her. No one is saying the community cannot have concerns. I paused. But concerns do not create ownership. That sentence changed the room. Because everyone understood the difference. A resident near the back raised his hand. So the HOA can't actually force him to remove the buffalo? Nobody answered immediately. They didn't need to. The documents had already answered. Victoria looked toward the board members. For the first time, I saw uncertainty on her face. The confidence she carried when she arrived at my gate was beginning to disappear. She had expected a debate. She expected emotions. She expected me to defend my ranch like someone who had something to prove. But I didn't need to prove I cared about the land. The land already proved that. The meeting continued for another hour. The board reviewed each document carefully. Every question led back to the same point. Authority. Where did the HOA's authority begin? And where did it end? By the end of the night, no final decision was announced. But something important had changed. The room no longer belonged to Victoria's version of the story. People had seen the records. They had heard the history. They understood that my ranch was not a problem waiting to be fixed. It was a piece of land that existed before anyone tried to regulate it. When I walked outside, the cool evening air hit my face. I looked back at the building. Victoria had spent weeks preparing to prove that my buffalo did not belong. But she had made one mistake. She brought everyone into the conversation. Because once people saw the truth, they couldn't pretend they never had. And this was only the beginning. The most dangerous people are not always the ones who break the rules. Sometimes they are the ones who believe the rules belong only to them. After the HOA meeting, I expected Victoria Langford to step back. She didn't. 3 days later, another envelope appeared at my ranch gate. The morning was cold, and a thin layer of fog covered the fields. I walked toward the gate expecting a delivery notice or a simple message. Instead, I found another official document. The Silver Pines Estates logo was printed at the top. I already knew who it was from before I opened it. Victoria. Inside was a request for another formal review. This time, the language was different. The first notice demanded action. This one attempted to create doubt. It mentioned unresolved concerns. It mentioned community impact. It mentioned further evaluation. But behind all those carefully chosen words was the same message. Victoria still believed she could force me to surrender. I folded the document and placed it inside my jacket. Then I walked back toward the house. The buffalo were moving across the pasture as the sun rose higher. They didn't know about meetings. They didn't know about paperwork. They didn't know someone had decided their existence needed approval. They were simply living where they had always lived. And somehow, that had become a problem for someone who never owned the land. That afternoon, I returned to my father's office. I needed to look deeper. The first records I found proved ownership. But I wanted to understand the full history. I opened every drawer, every cabinet, every old storage box. The room slowly filled with documents spread across the desk. Some were official, some were personal, some were just handwritten notes from my father. One notebook caught my attention. The cover was damaged. The pages were yellow from age. I opened it carefully. Inside were years of observations about the ranch. Weather patterns, animal movements, land maintenance. My father had recorded everything. Not because he had to, because he cared. Then I found a page that stopped me. It was written years before I inherited the ranch. The note was short. Someone will eventually try to change what they don't understand. Protect the land with facts, not anger. I read those words several times. Because that was exactly what was happening. Victoria didn't understand this ranch. She saw acreage. She saw animals. She saw something that didn't match the image she wanted for her community. She never saw the history. She never saw the people who built it. She never saw the responsibility behind it. That evening, I contacted a local property specialist to review the documents. I wanted another set of eyes. Not because I doubted my evidence. Because I knew something important. A truth kept private can be ignored. A truth supported by records becomes impossible to dismiss. The specialist reviewed the paperwork carefully. After several hours, he looked at me. Ethan, your records are stronger than you realize. Those words gave me confidence. Not because I wanted to defeat Victoria, because I knew I was protecting something bigger than myself. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday. Victoria had already sent another message to residents. She described the situation as a community concern. Again, she avoided the most important question. Who had authority? That night, I organized everything. The original deed, the boundary maps, the historical records, my father's notes. Each document represented a piece of the truth. Before closing the folder, I looked out across the dark fields. The buffalo stood quietly under the moonlight. The same land, the same animals, the same legacy. Only one thing had changed. Someone had challenged it. And now I was ready to answer. Not with anger, not with accusations, with proof. Because Victoria thought she was preparing for another HOA meeting. What she didn't realize was that she was preparing for the moment when every hidden detail of my family's history would finally come to light. The moment Victoria Langford realized I wasn't fighting her authority was the moment she understood I was exposing it. She had prepared for an argument. She never prepared for the truth. The final HOA review meeting was scheduled for Friday evening. By the time I arrived at Silver Pines Estates, the community center was already filled with people. Neighbors stood in small groups outside the entrance. Some looked at me with curiosity. Some looked uncomfortable. And a few gave me a quiet nod. That was the difference. A few weeks earlier, I was the stranger with the Buffalo Ranch. Now, people were starting to understand there was more to the story. I walked inside carrying the same folder I had prepared days before. The same folder that contained my family's history. Victoria was already waiting. She stood at the front of the room with a presentation ready. But something about her seemed different. She was still confident, still composed. But there was tension behind her expression. Because she knew this meeting would not be the same as the first one. The room became quiet as the HOA president opened the discussion. Tonight, we are here to address the concerns surrounding the ranch property. I listened carefully, not because I agreed, because I wanted everyone to hear exactly what she said. Victoria spoke about responsibility. She spoke about protecting residents. She spoke about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. Then she showed images of my buffalo near the property boundary. These animals create uncertainty, she explained. They create potential risks. She paused, and the HOA has a duty to respond. I looked around the room. People were listening. But this time, they were also thinking. Because they had already seen the documents. They already knew the ranch existed before the neighborhood. Victoria finished her presentation and turned toward me. Ethan, you may respond. I stood up and placed my folder on the table. I didn't start with the buffalo. I started with the land. This ranch was here before Silver Pines Estates. I placed the original deed in front of the board. This document proves the timeline. Then I placed the property maps beside it. These boundaries were established long before this HOA existed. The room became silent. I continued. The issue tonight is not whether people like my buffalo. I looked toward Victoria. The issue is whether anyone has the authority to control property they do not own. That sentence changed everything. Because it was the question nobody had asked at the beginning. Victoria had spent weeks explaining why she wanted the buffalo gone. But she had never explained why she had the right to make that decision. A board member picked up the documents and reviewed them carefully. Another resident asked, "So the HOA does not actually own this land?" "No," I answered. "The ranch has always been privately owned." Victoria stepped forward. "I understand the records, but we still have community concerns." I nodded. "And concerns matter." I paused. "But concerns cannot replace ownership rights." Nobody spoke after that. The board reviewed every document. The original deed, the boundary records, the ranch history, the conservation paperwork. Each piece removed another layer of doubt. After nearly an hour, the board president finally spoke. Based on the information presented, the HOA does not have authority to require the removal of the buffalo. The room stayed quiet. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't confusion. It was understanding. The 14-day demand that started this entire conflict was no longer valid. The threat was gone. The pressure was gone. And the truth was finally standing on its own. Victoria gathered her papers slowly. For the first time, she didn't look like someone in control. She looked like someone who had discovered the limits of that control. When I walked outside afterward, the night air felt lighter. I looked back at the community center. Then I looked toward the direction of my ranch. The fight had never been about winning against Victoria. It had always been about protecting something that mattered. And now everyone knew the same thing I knew from the beginning. My buffalo were never the problem. The problem was someone believing they could erase a legacy simply because they had a title. The hardest thing for someone who abuses authority is not losing power. It is watching people realize they never had as much power as they claimed. After the final HOA meeting, I thought the battle was over. The removal demand was defeated. The documents were clear. The community had finally seen the truth. But I learned something about people like Victoria Langford. They don't give up because they are wrong. They give up when they have no way left to hide it. 3 days after the meeting, I received another message from the HOA office. This time, it wasn't a demand. It was a request for a formal review of the ranch records. At first, I was surprised. Then I realized what was happening. The board wanted confirmation. They wanted an official understanding of what had happened. And honestly, I welcomed it. Because the truth should survive every review. I gathered the same documents again. The original deed. The property maps. The conservation records. My father's handwritten notes. Everything that showed the ranch history. I drove to the county office early that morning. The sun was still low, and the roads were quiet. As I sat in my truck, I looked toward the fields behind me. The buffalo were moving slowly across the land. The same way they had moved for generations. I thought about how close everything came to changing. Not because the ranch had a problem, but because someone unfamiliar with its history believed they understood it better than the people who protected it. Inside the county office, I met with a property specialist. His name was Daniel Mercer. He didn't know about the HOA conflict. He didn't know Victoria. And that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't need someone to agree with me. I needed someone to read the facts. I placed the documents on the table. Daniel reviewed them one by one. The room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Minutes passed. Then he looked up. Ethan, these records are very clear. Those words carried weight. Because for weeks, I had been hearing opinions. Now I was hearing confirmation. Daniel explained that the ranch boundaries were properly documented. The ownership history was consistent. And there was no record giving the HOA authority over the land. The 14-day demand had never been supported by actual ownership rights. It had been based on assumption. And assumptions are dangerous when they come from people who believe their position makes them untouchable. When I returned to the ranch that evening, I found Victoria's latest message waiting. She requested another HOA discussion. But the tone had changed. The confidence was gone. The words were more careful. She wasn't telling me what would happen anymore. She was asking questions. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. The person who once arrived at my gate believing she controlled the situation was now trying to understand the limits of her own authority. The next meeting was scheduled for the following week. But this time, I wasn't preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to finish what started at that gate. I walked through the old barn before sunset. The wooden walls carried decades of memories. The same place where I found my father's records. The same place where this entire fight changed direction. I touched the old workbench and thought about his advice. Facts, not anger. That was how he wanted this land protected. Not through shouting. Not through revenge. Through patience. Through preparation. Through truth. I closed the barn door and looked across the ranch. The buffalo were standing near the far fence line. The sky behind them was turning orange. Everything looked exactly as it should. And that was the thing Victoria never understood. She thought the ranch needed to change. But the only thing that needed to change was the belief that someone else could control it. Because the next time we entered that meeting room, she wouldn't be facing an owner trying to protect his property. She would be facing a history that could no longer be ignored. The final battle was never about whether my buffalo belonged on the ranch. It was about whether someone who never owned the land could decide its future. The morning of the final HOA vote arrived with a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't waking up wondering what Victoria Langford would try next. I already knew. She would come prepared. She would speak confidently. She would try to make one last argument that her authority mattered more than my family's history. But this time, everyone in the room would have the same information. And that changed everything. I arrived at Silver Pines Estates before the meeting started. The community center looked exactly the same as it had before. The same walls. The same chairs. The same place where Victoria first introduced my ranch as a problem. But the atmosphere was different. People were no longer waiting to hear what she thought. They were waiting to hear what the facts said. Inside, Victoria sat at the front table with the HOA board. She had a stack of papers in front of her. I recognized that look. It was the same confidence she carried when she arrived at my gate with the 14-day notice. But there was something missing. Certainty. The meeting began. Victoria spoke first. She thanked everyone for attending and explained that the HOA had reviewed the information regarding my property. She carefully avoided admitting that the original demand was wrong. Instead, she focused on moving forward. That was her way. Never acknowledge losing. Always reshape the story. But this time, the story belonged to everyone. When it was my turn, I stood up with my folder. I didn't bring more emotion. I didn't need it. The evidence had already done the work. I placed the original deed on the table, then the property maps, then the historical records. These documents show the timeline of this ranch, I said. They show ownership, boundaries, and the history of the land. I looked around the room. This was never about ignoring the community. It was about respecting the limits of authority. A resident near the front spoke. I think a lot of us misunderstood what was happening. I nodded. That happens when people only hear one side. Nobody looked at Victoria. They didn't need to. Everyone understood. The problem was never the buffalo. The problem was the assumption that a neighborhood association could reach beyond its own boundaries. The board reviewed the final documents. The room stayed quiet. Then the HOA president announced the decision. The removal request is officially withdrawn. The HOA does not have authority over the continued operation of the ranch or the presence of the buffalo on privately owned property. Those words ended everything. The 14-day deadline that started this entire conflict disappeared. The warnings disappeared. The pressure disappeared. But the lesson remained. After the meeting, I walked outside alone. The evening. Air was cool. The sky was turning orange over the fields. For a moment, I just stood there. I thought about the first day Victoria arrived. The SUVs. The paperwork. The confidence in her voice. She believed she was delivering a solution. She never realized she was creating a challenge. And that challenge forced me to discover something important. The strongest defense is not anger. It is preparation. It is knowing your history. It is protecting what matters with patience. When I returned to the ranch, the buffalo were moving across the field beneath the fading sunlight. The same land. The same animals. The same legacy. Nothing had changed. And that was the victory. Victoria wanted the ranch to become something else. But the ranch remained exactly what it had always been. A place built on family, responsibility, and truth. Because a person can challenge your property. They can challenge your decisions. They can even challenge your confidence. But they cannot erase something that was built on facts. And they cannot take away a legacy that was never theirs to control. I thought winning the battle would be the final chapter. But standing on my ranch after everything ended, I realized the real victory was never about defeating the HOA. It was about proving that some things are worth protecting. The weeks after the final meeting felt different. The ranch was quiet again. No more official notices. No more unexpected vehicles arriving at the gate. No more messages explaining what someone else believed I should do with my own land. For the first time since I inherited the ranch, I could focus on what mattered. Taking care of it. Every morning, I returned to the same routine my father followed for years. Checking fences. Walking the fields. Watching the buffalo. The simple things. The things that reminded me why this place was never just property. One evening, I walked to the old wooden gate, where Victoria Langford first handed me the 14-day notice. The paint was faded. The wood was weathered. But it was still standing. Just like the ranch. I placed my hand on the gate and remembered that first moment. Victoria arrived believing she was delivering a decision. She thought a piece of paper could change the future of my family's land. She thought authority came from a title. But she learned something I already knew. A title can give someone a position. It cannot give them ownership. A few days after the HOA decision, I received a letter from one of my neighbors. It wasn't an official document. It wasn't a complaint. It was an apology. He wrote that he had judged the ranch before knowing the full story. He said he only understood after seeing the records, after hearing both sides, after realizing that protecting a community does not mean controlling everything around it. I kept that letter, not because I needed an apology, because it reminded me how easily people can be influenced when they only hear one version of the truth. That was the biggest lesson from everything that happened. The loudest voice is not always the right one. The person with the most confidence is not always the person with the most authority. Sometimes the truth is quiet. It sits inside old records. It waits inside forgotten documents. It survives through generations of people who cared enough to preserve it. Months later, I opened my father's old notebook again. I turned through the pages filled with years of observations. The weather, the land, the buffalo, the small details he believed mattered. Near the back, I found one final note I had never noticed before. Protect what you inherit, because one day someone else will depend on what you preserved. I sat there for a long time, because I finally understood. My father wasn't just preparing me to manage a ranch. He was preparing me to protect a legacy. Today, when I stand outside and watch the buffalo move across the fields, I don't think about the HOA anymore. I don't think about Victoria. I think about the generations who stood on this land before me. I think about the responsibility that came with my name. And I think about how close everything came to disappearing because someone believed they could rewrite a story they never helped create. The HOA gave me 14 days to remove my buffalo. They believed they were removing animals. They were wrong. They were challenging history. They were challenging ownership. They were challenging something much bigger than themselves. And in the end, they discovered the same truth my family had always known. You can challenge a person. You can question a decision. You can even try to control what you do not understand. But you cannot erase a legacy built on truth. Because justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through patience, through evidence, through someone standing firm when everyone expects them to step aside. And as the sun sets over my 7,500-acre ranch, with the buffalo moving freely across the fields, I know one thing for certain. This land was never just something I inherited. It was something I was trusted to protect,